Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Hard to Be a God from 2013. And this is a winner of my Patreon movie review vote. If you would like for me to review a movie of your choice, then click on the link below for my Patreon and pledge, and maybe I'll be reviewing your movie next month. Hard to Be a God is sort of a difficult movie. It's a difficult movie to understand. It's a difficult movie in its subject matter and what it's filming. In fact, there's very little about this movie that isn't difficult in some way. This film is both, I find, really interesting, really beautiful, incredibly well shot, but also, I think, a little maybe overlong and frustrating in some degrees. I do like Russian film. I haven't seen a ton of it. And in terms of Russian film, I don't know if this is the best one to go into for this director, Alexei Gurman. This is based on a novel by two of the guys who wrote other novels that were made into more famous Russian language films, particularly The Stalker by Tchaikovsky. I think the concept of this, which is basically like scientists come to this planet which is almost exactly like Earth. They have been stuck in 800 years in the past. Like, they didn't have a renaissance. The renaissance, like culturally, scientifically, all that stuff that moved humanity forward out of the Dark Ages. And in this story, this planet that is not Earth is stuck in this time, and one of these astronauts or scientists who traveled from Earth to this planet that's very identical except for this one major difference, is trying to start a renaissance, basically try to get them to evolve. And he's kind of just stuck in realizing that maybe these people, this planet is just horrible and they're never going to progress, and as much as he's trying and keeps trying, it's never going to move on. And I think in some ways, and I've said this before, how you just choose to adapt something or how you choose to tell a story is almost more important in a lot of ways than the story itself. And I think in this case, this could be an amazing Twilight Zone episode. This could be an amazing movie if you did it in more of a literal kind of, Hollywood sort of a thing, or just more of a easier way to follow. But having the way they did it, which kind of plays like you're in an open world video game and you're dealing with like the worst open world thing you'd want to be in, reminded me of a previous Patreon movie review winner, Son of Saul, which I think is interesting. I don't think this this was his final film and had a lot of trouble making the 6 films he made in Russia. I don't think he was like a big, Grand Theft Auto fan or something, but it just sort of plays like that. Maybe that's the best way to describe it visually. Since you're not like following like plot points, you're more like living in these locations, seeing what this would be like, seeing the horror of that. You're kind of stuck with dealing with the idea that people wouldn't want to progress, and a society who would stop that progression. Now, this film, which came out in Russia in 2013, or at least it says 2013, I'm not sure when it came out in Russia, but it came out in English-speaking countries in, I believe, 2015. That was in a very different era of history. And at least in America, this film originally was about more of the communists, or the novel was, and I guess this film as well was more about living in Russia under communist rule and then living under Putin's rule. It's the kind of analogy that works quite well to work under, hey, even what's happening now in America and England and things like that. Even though it took this director, apparently he had been wanting to make it since the 60s. There was a 1989 film version of this story as well. I don't know it as well. I had never heard of it until Wikipedia told me. But I could understand if this film would be more looked at now. I think especially if you're feeling kind of trapped by our current political situation, I think this would be an interesting film. But it's sort of a very deep cinephile movie, because oftentimes when I was like an hour in, I was like, where is this going? Like, I'm watching this movie, but I'm not, like, what's going on? And you just kind of like sit there wondering, what is this? You're seeing little conversations, you're hearing people who clearly are completely uneducated, years older, but having the brains of like children, basically. Frankly, you've always read those articles where they say, oh, if you went back 100 years, you'd be like the most genius person ever because people would be all stupid and stuff. That's sort of what this film is like. I half think that's really interesting, and I like the analogy or metaphor, or whatever, that this filmmaker is trying to make, and I think it's an important analogy. But at the same time, I always disagree with like Mike Judge's Idiocracy, where it's like, yeah, I agree. Like, there are a lot of people you're going to deal with who are, you know, maybe sort of stupid, and you don't want to hear their shit about, like, whatever you're doing, and you consider them, like, after dealing with all that stuff, like, you know, mainly, you know, people at work or something like that, when you have to deal with these, you know, so-called idiots or something, you think lesser of them, and you think, you know, oh, the intellectuals and all these things. Without these things, like, this world would be so lost if we left it to them. I kind of don't maybe have the... Maybe I should, especially after watching this movie and living in today, believe that there wouldn't be someone who would evolve society. I don't really believe we would totally get stuck. I believe that there would be someone who came along, like anytime one artist, in terms of even this world, like a musician, a major musician goes away and has that kind of like prominence or something, someone else takes their place. And I believe someone else would, maybe in a different way, and find a way to navigate that. I don't believe that humanity would just stop for like almost 1,000, you know, rounded up as 800, but you know what I mean, for that long. I don't have that lack of humanity. I don't really agree when films do this thing where like the public would be lost, they're like sheep, and I don't view the public that way. I have more faith in the public. I think the public can surprise you both in disappointing ways and in exciting ways, acting like, you know, without leadership they would be fucking sheep and saying like, hey, look what happened in the Dark Ages. I mean, we don't know a lot because it was like the Dark Ages, but that argument of it I disagree with fundamentally, and I think it's kind of almost a classist way to look at being artistic or, you know, a creative. I don't feel that I'm better than someone who doesn't make YouTube videos or doesn't make animation or hasn't made animation or hasn't made a film or something like that. I don't believe that that makes me better than anyone, and I feel like a lot of times when people start these analogies, you get the opinion that because they've created something, they're therefore better than that other person, and that doesn't make you better than that other person. That's just a fundamental thing that I think like people, because if you do creative stuff, you get teased, you get made fun of, you don't get treated very well, you know, you'll be disregarded, and so there is a sense that you want to give yourself like, oh well, fuck them, I'm more important, or so forth. And I agree that certainly a lot of intellectuals who have that creative power do guide culture in certain ways, but I also agree that just because they are guiding it doesn't mean that the other people don't have an opinion or couldn't guide it themselves. You know, just because they're not naturally as good at creating something, they could come up with something better than the person that creates something. They're one time creating something. Like, you kind of have to be more open-minded with it, and Hard to Be a God kind of disappointed me in that regard, but and I understand it's a metaphor and an analogy and so forth, but I really just have never liked the kind of like people are sheep mentality. I don't view people that way. You know, most of the time I just think, I don't know, they're probably thinking something else, or they're creating something else that I don't understand. Thinking that way was something I would like more when I was younger, but when you get older, you kind of look at that and go, well, I don't know if I really feel that way about everyone. I don't know if that's necessarily true. I've met a lot of people in my life who haven't necessarily been like the most creative, or, you know, would laugh at me for like what I do or something, but at the same time I'd be like, oh my god, you're like how could you do that? So there's other ways, I think, that this film like kind of just wants to disregard, and that I didn't particularly love that argument, but I still think it's an interesting proposition, an interesting kind of intellectual kind of idea. I think this film is very brutal. Everyone brings up the scene in Monty Python and the Holy Grail where they're like, I think to make sure you get the right part, it was like, you know, when they're in that town with the witch and they go like, how do you know that guy's royalty? It was like, because he's the only person here that doesn't have shit on them. And that was like what it was like back then and so forth. So it's like you get all these people just like covered in shit. This isn't black and white, so you don't have to see the overall browniness that this film probably you imagine would be, and its ickiness and its horribleness and its backward ways about things. It's grimy and gross and like really making you deal with the fact that like with all of that erased completely. I keep hearing them call them wise guys, although I'm curious what that would be in Russian, or if that was like a translation thing. I do find it interesting, like making you live in a world without any of that. Although I do think you come to the conclusion rather quickly, so it's kind of like reiterating something that I'm like, maybe it doesn't necessarily need to reiterate in, but it gave me a lot of time to think about those ideas, which I think a lot of films wouldn't give you. I mean, they certainly wouldn't give you this much time, but they wouldn't give you the time to really like fully think about what it's presenting to you, which I quite liked that about it. And the cinematography, which is shot Yuri Kamenko and Vladimir Lin, who clearly had to track out these shots so much. I mean, there's probably as many cuts in this entire almost 3 hour movie that there are in action movie sequence. Like, there are very few cuts in it. It's like a lot of tracking shots. The one thing, the camera, and this never is really answered I felt suitably for me is that you never understand, like, the camera people like talk into the camera, like they're breaking the third wall and stuff, but it looks like the camera's like a character. Sometimes it looks like someone's perspective. But unlike, you know, if you have something like in the Halloween or Friday the 13th films where the camera being a perspective is a character and there's a reason for it, there's not necessarily a reason for it. And I think sometimes, like, that's one of the things about this film is, like, it feels very, like, everyone refers to, like, he has a little dinosaur, one of the guys on his suit of armor just looks like sort of a funny thing they did as a goof, but which is pretty prominent. And I kind of often wondered, like, well, like, you want all this meaning in this, but sometimes you just, like, throw that up in the air for style reasons, which is kind of an odd choice to make, I think. I am glad I saw this film, and I am glad it, like, kind of made me think about it, although I think about these things all the time, particularly right now in my life and what's going on in politics, and who you're friends with, and maybe not wanting to deal with people who want to solve things simply and not deal with the situation we're currently in and things of that nature, but or don't, you know, really believe in the intellectualism or don't really promote these kind of progression of society or anything like that. Hard to Be a God is a really interesting kind of cinephile find of a movie. I'm glad that I saw it because I don't see a lot of movies like this, but I wouldn't say if you're want to get into Russian film, this is not like a good film to watch first. It's a difficult movie. It's very difficult, not in just like how it's going to you know, be kind of like testing you thinking about these ideas, its ugliness, its length, like how it's telling a story in kind of a way that almost feels like it doesn't have a plot, even though this scientist who's Don Rumada is trying to find this guy Don Reba, who's like a prime minister of this town. And there's kind of that, but then you have these two characters both called Don in this movie that's not exactly clear. It's just like, okay, guys, what are we doing? I think Hard to Be a God just brings out this kind of loves its metaphor and feels trapped by it, and from a director who had so many problems making films and being creative and was hampered down by a society and a culture and a government, I can totally understand why he would want to make a film like this. And it makes sense, like reading I've just read, you know, stories and things about his life. It seems like this was a story that would definitely appeal to him, but maybe it's because I didn't live under that as much. Maybe, you know, 10 years after all this nonsense is going down, I'll feel more attached to it. But I disagree with what I said before about the whole metaphor of it, although I still think it is a pretty stunning achievement, and it's an achievement in filmmaking that he was able to make it in the way he was and show the supreme ugliness and have you fucking deal with it. And there's not a lot of directors who would necessarily do that, but I did feel like this film was almost like a little too kind of long, almost a little too up its own ass about these ideas. I wish it had kind of maybe reined it in a little bit, and I feel like the ideas and the metaphor and all those things about this film let it kind of like breathe in the way it did, and I sort of love it for being, you know, its uniqueness. But I also, like, towards the end I was like, all right, is this like this is still going, we're still in this, you know. There's sometimes I was questioning where this scene was leading or something, and I think it's more about the mood and it's more about letting you breathe in it, and I think for the most part I was fine with it, even if I questioned the whole validity of actually breathing it in the whole time. So if you have seen Hard to Be a God and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. And this was a winner of my Patreon movie review vote. If you would like for me to review a movie of your choice, then click on the link below and pledge, and maybe I'll be reviewing your movie next month. Thank you very much for watching.